The Quiet Panic. Story happened when I was 12 years old and completely changed how I viewed my family forever. My dad had always been protective of us kids, but there was one rule in our house that seemed absolutely bizarre. We were never, under any circumstances, allowed to talk to the man who lived 3 houses down from us. Not just a casual warning to stay away from strangers, but a strict, almost terrified command that if we ever saw this particular man, we were to immediately come inside and tell him. The weird part was, this man looked exactly like my father. I'm talking identical twins level of similarity. Same height, same build, same dark hair with the exact same receding hairline. Even the same way of walking, with his left shoulder slightly higher than his right. The resemblance was so uncanny that multiple neighbors had approached my mom at the grocery store, confused about why my dad had ignored them when they waved hello. Ish. But my father's reaction whenever anyone mentioned this man was unlike anything I'd ever seen. His face would go completely pale. His hands would start shaking, and he'd change the subject immediately. My mom would get this worried look in her eyes and start fidgeting with her wedding ring whenever the topic came up. Something was seriously wrong, and as a curious 12-year-old, I was determined to figure out what it was. The first time I actually saw this mysterious doppelganger was on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I was walking home from school with my younger sister Emma when she suddenly grabbed my arm and pointed down the street. There he was, standing in his front yard, watering his flowers. The moment I laid eyes on him, I felt this weird chill run down my spine. It was like looking at my dad, but something was just off. The way he moved was too slow, too deliberate. His smile, when he noticed us staring, seemed forced and didn't reach his eyes. Emma whispered, "That's him, isn't it? The man Dad told us to avoid." I nodded, unable to look away. The man raised his hand in a wave, and that's when I noticed his fingers. They were longer than my dad's, almost unnaturally so. He called out something, but we were too far away to hear clearly. It sounded like he was trying to get our attention, maybe even calling us by name. We ran home faster than we'd ever run before. When we burst through the front door, breathless and panicked, my dad took one look at our faces and knew exactly what had happened. His expression shifted from confusion to pure terror in seconds. He made us sit down at the kitchen table and for the first time ever tried to explain why we needed to stay away from that man. But his explanation made absolutely no sense. He said the man was dangerous, that he'd been watching our family for years, and that under no circumstances should we ever be alone if we saw him outside. When I pressed for more details, asking why this man looked exactly like him, my dad's voice cracked. He said there were things about his past that he couldn't discuss. Things that happened before Emma and I were born that he was still trying to protect us from. My mom chimed in, saying that some people in this world aren't who they appear to be, and that this particular person had been causing problems for our family since before we moved to this neighborhood. She mentioned something about legal issues and restraining orders, but again, no real specifics, just vague warnings and fearful glances between my parents. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with figuring out who this man really was. I started paying attention to his daily routine from my bedroom window. Every morning at exactly 7:15, he'd come outside to get his newspaper. He'd stand there for a few minutes, always looking in the direction of our house before going back inside. Sometimes I'd catch him in his backyard, just standing there staring at our kitchen window during dinner time. The creepiest part was that he seemed to know our schedule. On days when my dad worked late, the man would be outside more often, almost like he was keeping track of when my father wasn't home. Emma started having nightmares about him, saying she dreamed that he was standing in our backyard just watching our house in the middle of the night. Things escalated one evening in November when my dad was at a work conference overnight. My mom was making dinner when she suddenly froze, staring out the kitchen window. Her face went completely white and she immediately closed all the blinds in the house. She called my dad's cell phone, speaking in hushed panic tones about how he was out there again and asking when Dad would be home. That night, Mom made us sleep in her bedroom. She said it was just for fun, like a family sleepover, but I could tell she was terrified. She kept checking the locks on all the doors and windows, and I heard her on the phone with someone, possibly the police, talking about increased patrol in our neighborhood. The next morning, when my dad came home early from his conference, I overheard my parents having an intense conversation in their bedroom. My mom was crying, saying something about how he's getting bolder and asking if they needed to move again. Move again? That was the first time I'd heard anything about us having lived somewhere else before this house. My dad's voice was shaking as he told her that moving wouldn't solve the problem, that this person would just follow us wherever we went. He mentioned something about a mistake he'd made years ago before he met my mom, something that this man would never let him forget. There was talk about lawyers and private investigators, about evidence that had been destroyed, and about protecting Emma and me from the truth until we were old enough to understand. But understand what? What had my father done that would cause someone to stalk our family for years? Why did this man look exactly like him? And why did both my parents seem convinced that he posed a real threat to our safety? The breaking point came 3 days later. I was in my room doing homework when I heard Emma scream from the backyard. I ran to the window and saw her standing frozen by our swing set, staring at the fence that separated our yard from the woods behind our house. The doppelganger man was standing just on the other side of that fence, maybe 10 feet away from her, holding something in his hands. My mom came running outside and immediately scooped Emma up, carrying her into the house while yelling for me to get away from the windows. She called my dad at work, and within 20 minutes there were 2 police cars in our driveway. The officers spent over an hour walking around our property and interviewing my parents, but by then the man had disappeared. That evening, my dad sat Emma and me down for what he called a serious family discussion. He said that the time had come for us to know more about why we needed to be so careful around this particular person. His hands were shaking as he began to speak, and my mom kept dabbing at her eyes with tissues. What he told us that night would explain everything about our mysterious neighbor, but it would also reveal a secret about my father's past that would change how I saw him forever. A secret that involved a twin brother he'd never mentioned, a tragic accident from 20 years ago, and a promise he'd made that he thought would keep our family safe. But promises, as I was about to learn, don't always protect the people you love most. My dad took a deep breath and looked directly at both Emma and me. His voice was barely above a whisper when he finally said the words that would shatter everything I thought I knew about our family. The man living 3 houses down wasn't just someone who happened to look like my father. He was my father's identical twin brother, Marcus. But Marcus wasn't just any twin brother. 23 years ago, when my dad was 19, he and Marcus had been inseparable. They did everything together, went everywhere together, and according to my dad, Marcus had always been the more outgoing and charismatic of the two. People gravitated toward Marcus in a way they never did toward my father. The problem was that Marcus had also always been unstable. Even as kids, he'd shown signs of what my dad now recognized as serious mental health issues. Marcus would have explosive fits of rage, followed by periods where he'd become obsessively fixated on people or situations. Their parents had tried getting him help, but back then the resources weren't what they are today. When they turned 18, Marcus started getting into serious trouble. He'd been arrested multiple times for stalking ex-girlfriends, breaking into people's homes, and what the police called disturbing the peace. Each time, my dad would bail him out, thinking that family loyalty meant standing by Marcus no matter what he did. Everything changed one night in March when they were both 19. Marcus had become obsessed with a girl named Sarah who worked at the local movie theater. She'd repeatedly told him she wasn't interested, but Marcus wouldn't accept no for an answer. He'd started showing up at her work, following her home, and leaving gifts on her doorstep that she didn't want. My dad tried reasoning with Marcus, explaining that his behavior was scaring Sarah and that he needed to leave her alone. But Marcus accused my father of being jealous, claiming that my dad wanted Sarah for himself. The accusation was completely false, but Marcus had worked himself into such a state that he couldn't see reason. On the night everything went wrong, Marcus had convinced my dad to drive him to Sarah's apartment complex. He claimed he just wanted to apologize and leave her alone after that. My dad, hoping that Marcus was finally coming to his senses, agreed to take him there. But when they arrived, Marcus didn't go to apologize. Instead, he tried breaking into Sarah's apartment through a window. My dad realized what was happening and tried to stop him, but Marcus had completely lost control. He attacked my father with a piece of broken glass, leaving a scar that my dad still carries on his left shoulder. During the struggle, Sarah's downstairs neighbor called the police. When the officers arrived, they found my dad bleeding on the ground and Marcus standing over him, still holding the glass shard. Sarah was unharmed, but she was traumatized by the entire experience. Marcus was arrested and eventually sentenced to 5 years in prison for assault and attempted breaking and entering. During his trial, he became convinced that my dad had set him up, that the whole thing had been planned to get Marcus out of the way so my father could pursue Sarah himself. My dad met my mom 2 years later, and they started building a life together. He thought Marcus was safely locked away and that the nightmare was finally over. He never told my mom about his twin brother during their early relationship, hoping that chapter of his life was permanently closed. But Marcus was released after serving only 3.5 years for good behavior. The first thing he did was track down my father's address. He started showing up at my dad's work, calling at all hours of the night and following my parents when they went out together. The harassment got so bad that my parents had to move across the state, hoping distance would solve the problem. That's when my dad finally told my mom the truth about Marcus. They thought they'd successfully disappeared, that Marcus would never find them again. For a few years it worked. Emma was born, then I came along 2 years later, and we lived peacefully in our old town without any sign of Marcus. My dad started to believe that maybe his brother had finally moved on, found help, or at least found someone else to fixate on. But when I was 7 years old, Marcus found us again. My parents came home from grocery shopping one Saturday afternoon to find him sitting on our front porch, looking exactly like my father, but with that same unsettling smile I'd noticed from our kitchen window. He told my parents he'd been watching us for months, learning our routines and getting to know his nephew and niece from a distance. He claimed he just wanted to be part of the family, that prison had changed him and he was ready to make amends for his past behavior. My dad didn't believe him for a second. The way Marcus talked about Emma and me, referring to us as his kids and saying how proud he was of how we were growing up, made my father's skin crawl. Marcus hadn't changed at all. He'd simply transferred his obsession from Sarah to our entire family. The restraining order my mom had mentioned was real, but it was difficult to enforce because Marcus was careful never to technically violate its terms. He'd stay just far enough away to avoid legal consequences while still making his presence known. He'd wave from his car when he drove past our house. He'd shop at the same grocery stores as my mom, always making sure she saw him in the aisles. The most disturbing part was that Marcus had somehow convinced the landlord of the house 3 doors down to rent to him. He'd used a fake name and fake references, but once he was established as a tenant, there wasn't much anyone could do to remove him quickly. My dad explained that the reason we could never talk to Marcus wasn't just about safety, though that was certainly part of it. The bigger issue was that Marcus was incredibly manipulative and skilled at making people believe he was the victim in every situation. He'd already approached several of our neighbors, spinning stories about how my father had stolen his identity, ruined his life, and was now trying to keep Marcus away from his own family. Some of the neighbors had started looking at my dad suspiciously, wondering if there was more to the story than they knew. Marcus had even tried contacting Emma's school, claiming to be her father and asking about her academic progress and daily schedule. Fortunately, the school had strict policies about verifying identities, but the attempt had terrified my parents. The object Emma saw Marcus holding by our fence that day turned out to be a photo album. When the police searched the area later, they found dozens of pictures he'd taken of our family from a distance. Pictures of us leaving for school, playing in the backyard, and even some taken through our kitchen window during dinner. My dad's voice broke as he explained that he'd spent years trying to protect Emma and me from this situation, hoping we could grow up normally without the fear that had dominated his own life since Marcus's release from prison. But Marcus was getting bolder, more desperate, and my dad was running out of options to keep us safe. The lawyers had told him that unless Marcus actually committed a crime or violated the restraining order in a way they could prove, there wasn't much more the legal system could do. That night, as Emma and I processed everything we'd learned, I finally understood why my parents had always seemed so tense, why we'd moved when I was young, and why my dad checked the locks on our doors every single night before bed. We weren't just dealing with a strange neighbor who happened to look like my father. We were living 3 houses away from a man who'd been stalking our family for years. Someone who believed we belonged to him, and someone who would never stop trying to insert himself into our lives. The scariest part wasn't what Marcus had already done. It was knowing that my dad had no idea what Marcus might do next, and that after all these years, his obsession with our family was only getting stronger. That's when my parents told us we'd be moving again, this time much farther away, and that we could never tell anyone where we were going. But moving wouldn't be enough to